Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Noah Breyer, co-founder of Alephic, and I'm joined by Lance Martin, founding engineer at LangChain. And today we are going to talk about context engineering. My one thing I'll admit is that when we came up with the topic for this episode, I told Lance how much I hated the term because I just kind of felt like it didn't add much, though I have to say I've come around on it a little bit. But Lance, why don't you kick us off and tell us about what is context engineering and why should we care about it?
Yeah, absolutely. The first places I heard the term was actually from Karpathy. So this tweet right here.
Patron saint of forward deployed.
Yes, exactly. So Karpathy kind of lays this out as the delicate art and science of filling the context window with just the right information for the next step. And this is particularly relevant to like an agent where it's performing a trajectory of actions. And you want to give it the information it needs to perform the correct next action. So that's kind of a good overall kind of definition of the challenge.
Can I just interrupt you there with a quick question? Because I think this is my challenge with the word has been, how do you break it down as different from prompt engineering fundamentally?
Yeah. So I think the way I would think about that is really prompt engineering kind of predates context engineering. Prompt engineering is particularly relevant in the context of, for example, like chatbots when you are talking about like prompt response. And the prompt is something that a user is controlling and crafting that's being passed to the LLM to do a thing. Now, I think that the trick is that with agents, we have context coming into an agent through two mechanisms. So one is the original prompt, like, for example, the system prompt or system instructions, and, for example, any user messages that go in, kind of helping to guide the agent. But also context is coming into agents through tool calls. So an agent you can think about simply as like an LLM with a number of tools bound to it, and it's autonomously calling those tools in a loop until some termination condition. So the trick is that context is coming in not only through the original system instructions or user instructions, which we think of as things that we kind of control, i.e. that's kind of the world of typically prompt engineering, but also through all these tool calls. And that's where things get messy. And that's exactly, I think, why this kind of term emerged and is quite nice. I can talk about a few different flavors for context engineering that have emerged.
Yeah, why don't you go into it?
So a few months ago, I did a webinar with Manus. They're a very popular consumer agent, very, very smart company. And we talked a lot about how Manus is approaching it. So the way I kind of broke this down, there's these three big buckets of approaches for content engineering. We can talk about what's happening in Manus and kind of broaden out to even beyond Manus. But the trends that I've seen quite a bit are reducing context, isolating context, and offloading context. So just to give kind of an overview of these various things, reducing context is very simply reducing the size of the context that's being passed to, for example, the agent at every turn. So here's a simple example. Like when you're using Claude Code, you can do compaction. So compaction basically summarizes the messages in the agent's trajectory into like a crisp summary, and that saves lots of tokens. That's one mechanism for context reduction. Manus talks about kind of a different approach where they actually take tool calls. You can kind of see here in this little diagram. So these are like the tool results that have come in, and they're often like very token heavy, right? Like, for example, you're calling a search tool, you get a bunch of context back from that search tool. What they do is they do a compaction step. And what they mean by that is not exactly what Claude Code means by compaction. In their case, Manus basically takes that tool result and saves it to the file system. And then it significantly debloats that message history. So the message history then only has a pointer to the file, not the entire tool result. And they do this using some heuristic like older tool calls get quote unquote compacted and sent to the file system. So that's one overall kind of category that we see. Context reduction, as mentioned, Claude Code does this via compaction. Manus does it via also what they call compaction. In their case, they're just saving it to the file system. But the idea is the same. Basically, reduce the size of the context window using some approach.
Can I ask you a quick question on that one? So there's two other methods here. I'm curious if you think of them as reduction methods. One of them is essentially just writing tighter context, right? Like for a while, we would write very, very long prompts. And if you look at some of the trends now, I'm seeing it especially in agent skills, it's towards really, really compact, really tight. If you look at the Anthropic front-end design skill, I think it's like 700 words. So, do you put that in context reduction? And then the other one I was thinking about is the way skills and Claude Code are kind of dynamically loading that context just in time.
Yeah. Okay. This is a really good one. We're actually going to get to skills. I don't quite call that. I actually consider that to be a context offloading approach. It does have the effect of reducing the size of the context. So there's obviously kind of there's some overlap between these categories. It's not perfect, but that's actually a good segue to the idea of context offloading. And specifically, context offloading, the idea there is that you're moving things from the context window to the file system. So Manus is actually doing this when they do this compaction step. They're taking something from the message history, which is all living in context in the context window, and they're basically shifting it out to the file system. But this idea is a lot more general. So Anthropic Multi-Agent Researcher does this. So basically at the start of research, they create a research plan, and then they just save that to disk. And then it's persisted, and they can pull it back into context selectively as needed to help steer the agent. Like, for example, the nice thing about offloading context is you make it available to the agent at later steps in its trajectory.
Right. This offloading kind of also gets into the conversation we had about skills versus MCPs, right? Where, the challenge with MCPs is that they're constantly loaded into that context. And so eventually they can completely overwhelm it. And the ability to kind of dynamically load them just when you need them is a very interesting one.
Yes. So actually, I think what's really interesting is skills are a really good example of offloading as well. Because think about what's happening here. So typically, if you're using MCP or even defining your own tools, what you're doing is you're taking your LLM and you're basically giving it a bunch of tools, and you're actually loading all those tool descriptions into the context window. And this is a classic problem. So for example, if you have 20 or 100 tools, all those tool descriptions live in context. So you're bloating your context window with all these tool descriptions. It can be very token heavy, very token costly. The intuition behind skills, the way I think about it is like you're taking all those tools, like all those actions, and you're basically just offloading them to the file system. Literally, you're saving them in a bunch of folders. There's some skill MD in each folder, and you're only loading, like the progressive disclosure idea right here, you're only loading just that YAML front matter into the context window when you start the agent. So you're offloading all those tokens that typically live in context. If you're like defining a bunch of tools, you're offloading all those to the file system, and you're only loading in just the YAML front matter. So you're right. It's actually kind of bridging the two because it has a significant benefit in terms of context reduction. But I think the principle here is more like offloading. You're taking things that would live in context and just pushing it out to the file system. So I think it's another really good example of this principle of context offloading, which I think is a really smart approach. Now, the catch, and Simon mentioned this, Simon Willison had a really good write-up on this. He said the catch is you need to give agents access to a file system, i.e. a computer. And that's a very important dependency, and not every production agent has that. But if you have that ability to give the agent a file system, you can perform offloading really nicely. And in fact, so Manus does that. If I go back to that Manus post, what's pretty interesting is Manus ships, and there's a nice blog post from E2B on this. Manus actually ships with a sandbox. So every Manus agent actually has access to a file system. And that's why it's able to do this offloading. And they talked about this quite a bit in our webinar. For example, they talked about a few things: offloading tool calls, offloading plans. And it's a very nice general trick. They also, interestingly, what's very funny about this is they talk a lot about building like what they called a two-tier action space. So having a few functions bound to the LLM, and then just basically offloading everything else to the file system and having a bunch of scripts that can just call. And that's exactly what skills is, by the way. So actually, I feel like Manus they were quite smart in terms of like laying that idea out. And skills is like a broader, more popularized like framing of that exact same principle.
I've been having a lot of fun this week building with some sandboxes. I'm using Vercel sandboxes for what it's worth, but I'm running the Agents SDK and running these sandboxed Claude Code workloads, and just finding different and very interesting ways to actually tie these agents into broader applications. So I was building out a whole data pipeline, and a lot of it is fairly simple processing stuff. It doesn't need a whole lot. There's little bits of AI here and there. But for some of the more complicated pieces, rather than building a whole control flow that's sat on the top of it, being able to sandbox that whole thing out. And then you start thinking about really interesting questions like, how do you provide context back to the sandbox from your application? So I ended up having to essentially build a skill into the sandbox that I passed in with a bunch of code that allowed it to get back out to my application to query the API and get some of the data back, because the value of this isolated environment is that you can do all this file system stuff without screwing anything up. But obviously the challenge is, but I feel like there's whole new patterns there that I've really only started to think about. I feel like so many of the sort of sandbox environment conversations are also so isolated to, like Manus and Claude Code, where it's really fundamentally an agent with a sandbox rather than an application with the sandbox. And anyway, I've been playing with some of those patterns, and maybe it's something that we can talk about more in the future. But I think it's really interesting to think about not just how do you give it the right context in that moment, but also how do you give it back the context of your application so it understands where it's executing and what it's executing, and then how are you passing these things back and forth?
So you're using the file system in your versatile sandbox then. So it's like the agent's running, it's like using the file system as needed to do its tasks. And then like you need to egress some information back out to your application from this like sandbox agent using its own file system to do things.
Right. So it does a combination of structured output. I give it a structured input and it gives me back a structured output. And then any files it creates, I write to blob storage, and then I get those files back from blob storage. And then I just kill the whole sandbox. It's fully ephemeral.
Yeah. Yes. Those are interesting patterns. We should talk about that more in depth at a later point. But because I think a lot of people are thinking about this. In fact, I had a call recently with someone who was working on deploying agents and like, wait, how do I think about agents plus sandbox and file system now? If this is like a primitive that many agents will benefit from, like how do you think about that? And like what's the best deployment environment and so forth? These are all interesting questions.
So you went through reduce and offload. Let's get to the last one of your.
Let's get to the last one here, and then I have a new one I'm going to add actually. Okay, so context isolation, that's just subagents. We talked about that a lot. One thing I want to highlight that I think is kind of mildly interesting is I think often subagents are like improperly used. Like I think people often anthropomorphize them. It's like, oh, okay, I'm going to have 10 subagents, one for each sub role in my org. It's like, no. These LLMs' cognitive capacity is way beyond what a human can do. Like an AI can be both a product manager and engineer. Like they don't need separate subagents. The benefit of subagents is isolating context. So it's like if there's a job, you can isolate and just do that job within like an isolated context window and just pass the result back. That's good because it saves tokens in your like parent agent. So thinking about subagents in terms of context isolation is a lot better than thinking about subagents in terms of like anthropomorphized job splitting.
Right. Sometimes I think they line up, right?
Sometimes they do.
The easiest pattern that I've used a bunch is researchers. It's like, hey, you're going to go consume a bunch of tokens. You're going to read a ton of sites, and I want the final output at the end, but I don't want to spoil my entire context window with the 100,000 tokens of web content that you read. So just give me the output. That does happen to line up, but I hear your point completely, and I agree with that.
No, and that's a great one. Research is the canonical subagent use case. It's like, yes, all this research can be done in isolation. You pass the results back. You don't need those 100,000 tokens of research that you pulled. 100%. And you're right. In that case, they line up. A lot of times they don't. So anyway,
for what it's worth, one of the other really interesting isolate patterns I've seen, and I think I first saw this in the Obra magic skills, I'll put the link in the show notes, was a kind of test-driven development where you used agents because they're blank slates. So you're specifically using the fact that they don't have any exposure to the outside world, that they don't have exposure to the rest of your context. And so you can kind of give it this new file or this new skill, or you can ask it for an opinion without poisoning it with anything that you've already said. And, I think often we think about the isolation in terms of the researcher, because that is the canonical one. I just don't want to kill my entire context window. But I really liked this flipping. You're using the fact that it has no outside information as a skill in and of itself.
Yeah. I mean, no, it's a good point. But what's tricky about this, though, and this is actually kind of a good segue. So Cognition had a good blog post, and they were explicitly arguing don't build multi-agents, and they talked a lot about the problem of like information bottlenecking. It's a good post. You should read it. So Cognition had a good blog post talking about don't build multi-agents. The crux of their argument is multi-agents have this kind of information bottlenecking problem. You spawn a subagent, and it doesn't have the full context of the parent. And so if you have tasks that are like highly coupled, where like two or three different subagents need to coordinate with one another, it's very hard to kind of share information. Or like if a subagent needs a lot of the same context as the parent, it may or may not have that depending on how you initialize it. So this is a really good call out. I want to just mention briefly, Manus and I talked about this, and they had a nice figure talking about like, in some cases, when you spawn a subagent, you can specify its job really easily as like maybe a few lines of text. And this is like the classic research use case, right? Just research this topic. You can use your web search tools. It's a fully quarantined task. It doesn't need any other context. Research this thing, give it 2 sentences, it goes, gives you a result. That's the cleanest case. But like there are other cases where Manus mentions you also with subagents, you can share, for example, like the file system, give it like a shared context with the parent. So it can access the same files and sometimes even sharing the entire conversational history, which is not really token saving, or it at least has a pretty significant token impact on like the subagent, but at least it has all the information that the parent does. So just as a quick call out, like subagents and multi-agents can be tricky because of this context isolation thing, how much you need to give it and show it. And that's kind of tricky. So I do want to call that out. And I think Manus talks about some interesting scenarios, and that's just what I show in this diagram.
And that's kind of what I ran into a little bit with my sandbox stuff. And you know, it created a kind of real world example of this. So again, I was building this pipeline. Essentially, we do all this call processing, and we need to kind of go through a whole bunch of kind of researching and understanding the call. And historically, I'd done it using a control flow with a bunch of AI steps. And I'm still doing a lot of the kind of basic cleanup stuff using a basic control flow with some AI cleanup steps. But there were big enough pieces, and I wanted to try some new techniques. And so I wrote the whole thing off to this sandbox, which is effectively a subagent, right? You know, if you think about the kind of overall control flow as the main agent. And yeah, I immediately, it was like, oh, well, the annoying thing here is, do I have to pre-give it all the context at the beginning? Because you're literally spinning up a new computer as a sandbox. So whatever you pass in is everything it knows. So I've got to, you know, install any packages and give it any context. And yeah, what I ended up doing, I thought for a little bit about actually building my app into an MCP and then passing that MCP into the sandbox. And then what I ended up doing was essentially just giving it a fairly simple skill and a read-only access to my database so that it could hit the core tables that it needed. And that seemed to have solved the problem, but it's not without its trade-offs, right? Like it's, you know, and there are really clean cases like research where essentially you can operate in a vacuum and be totally fine. I want you to go tell me everything about Manus. It comes back and that's really all I want to know. And it can use as many tokens as it wants to use, but there aren't that many of those kinds of situations. And so, you know, I think it's maybe an extension and on the whole context engineering idea is kind of, I think all of this is kind of getting at the same question, right? This is turtles all the way down thing. Like even subagents are just agents, right? We're just sandboxing the sandbox.
It's just sandbox agent. That's right. It's just a sandbox agent. Yeah, no, that's right. I'm going to tell you about my fourth now. This is a new one. It's not in this blog post. I'm still kind of exploring the idea. I don't even know if it's the right term for it. So I'm going to call this one evolving context. We're workshopping it live a little bit. I'll share a blog post I wrote up about this a little bit. So basically, this is kind of a cool paper. And they called it evolving context for self-improving language models. So what's the big idea here? The big idea here is simply that you can have an agent that's doing things, producing these trajectories. And basically, you can have like a reflection process over those trajectories. And you can use those reflections to go back and update, for example, the system prompt to update instructions. If you think about the system prompt as being like persisting on disk and being some set of like a set of instructions, then this reflection process is a way to kind of iteratively update those over time. And I want to make this concrete with a fun little example I put together called Claude Diary. So basically, and I think, Noah, you'll appreciate this, given that you are a very, very heavy Claude Code user. The intuition is dead simple. You enter Claude Code in these sessions. Those sessions are actually stored locally to disk. in this, like in Claude.projects, and there's all these session logs and there's JSON, right? So you have all those you have all those session histories saved. What I did was I set up two simple custom commands. One is a diary command and the other is a reflect command. So the diary command, here's like kind of the loop here. The diary command looks at any given Claude session and saves key decisions, key things done, summarize what was kind of the overall work plan, summarize that to a diary entry. It's like basically a summary of the Claude session, okay? Now, those diary entries accumulate over time. So you have all these diary entries from all your different sessions with Claude. And then I have a separate command called reflect, which looks across all those diary entries and then proposes updates to CLAUDE.md. CLAUDE.md, of course, persists on disk, and that's what's sucked up into Claude when you initialize a new session. So it's a really simple kind of memory feedback. I put this on Twitter. It kind of did pretty well. It's a plugin right now, but that's a general idea. I'll let you react to that first.
Yeah, I love this idea. I've played with this a few times myself, trying to do kind of variations on this theme. One thing I thought about building a version of this a while back where I was going to send the entire session off to Gemini because it had such a bigger context window.
Right.
See if it could, how it would do in kind of isolating it. You know, I think one thing that's just interesting as an observation is all of these are kind of primitives, right? And you're kind of like recombining them. And so another way to think about what you're doing is you're writing and reducing again, which are just the primitives that you already mentioned in the overall context engineering to some effect, right? Like you're offloading this thing. You're taking the initial one, which is already offloaded. You're reducing it down. And then essentially your update to the CLAUDE.md is just kind of reducing it further and summarizing it. The other thing, just as a note that I think is interesting, and this is an area, I'd be curious if you run into this at all, but it's just something I've been thinking a lot about is like, I kind of feel like CLAUDE.md and is kind of hitting a similar point to prompt engineering where you're getting diminishing returns on the tokens in there. And so it's going to become less and less about sort of adding more and more information and more about sort of how you articulate that information and how you kind of like feed it to the model in the most optimal way. So it's not just about sort of the overall content. It's like we're looping back to prompt engineering, but now prompt engineering, I think, is going to be about being a really good writer in a way where it's like, you know, it's very Strunk and White is my favorite writing style guide. And, you know, there's one of the core tenets of Strunk and White is reduce unnecessary words. And, you know, I feel like we're getting to that thing. And I wonder if just as you've actually used this, have you run into any problems where you're now bloating up your CLAUDE.md and you've got to figure out now new ways to kind of reduce back down and you're following kind of these same patterns?
Yeah, let me tell you something funny about that. I mentioned that here a little bit, and actually I'd be curious to get your take on these different design decisions. I kind of tried to enumerate them in the blog because frankly, like I'm still figuring this out. I don't precisely know that these are the right patterns. I can zoom in a little bit. But so one thing I found that I need to do in the reflect step, and this is all promptable, by the way, so you can just play with these prompts. I read back in CLAUDE.md first. So that basically in this reflection step, I read that back in. And so when it's proposing new rules, it's kind of like recombining or like kind of crafting the original CLAUDE.md. It's not just appending. You can't do append only. Because basically then you get this laundry list of new rules that get appended. You have to do kind of a resynthesis of your CLAUDE.md. So I kind of prompted to do that, but like I'm not sure how good that is.
You have to follow that idea in
Strunk and White
that when you add a new law, you have to remove two.
Yeah, that kind of idea. That's funny, right? You have to like kind of recombine. Exactly. Well, it's funny because I actually found that like, if you're doing append only, you can also get contradictory rules.
Yeah.
So you have all these issues. So you actually have to be kind of recombining. And so that's a very subtle but important point. Initially, I didn't reread the CLAUDE.md explicitly. So I guess it's automatically pulled in when you init a Claude session, and Claude runs the reflect command. So like it was there, but like in the prompt itself, I told it explicitly reread CLAUDE.md as you're performing this command to like further steer the agent to like be thoughtful about how it's updating it. So I think that's important point one. I will make a note that you mentioned like it is incorporating the idea of kind of reduction in the sense that it's taking this long session and summarizing it down to a diary entry. I don't know for sure that you need to do that. So like you had mentioned, you also could take the raw session logs and plumb all those in full to like maybe a Gemini or whatever. I think, 4.5 is 4.5 opus is a million
Context,
tokens,
yeah.
right? Yeah, right. So you could also think about taking full session logs, just plumbing them all in without this separate, like kind of summarizing step, and do reflection over those. I just was a little bit worried about context there, which is a valid worry, to be honest, because
One fun experiment here that occurs to me, and it kind of goes back to that isolation comment I made earlier, is it might be really interesting to think about using some purposefully isolated subagents here to help be a judge. So,
yeah,
without all of the other context, if they just
yeah,
looked at the CLAUDE.md and they just looked at the new rule or new
right,
technique or whatever was being proposed to be added, and they were a
right,
really tough judge who had none of the other context about the rest of the context.
yes,
Because again, this is where I haven't done enough with this, but I just love this
yeah,
idea that you can really take advantage of the isolation. We think of poisoning as a really negative thing, right? Like, hey,
yeah,
there was a hallucination that happened earlier and it's poisoned the session. But actually, poisoning is what we're doing all the time, right? Like, as soon as you give it that old context, you've poisoned it. It can't ever get that out. And
yeah, yeah,
so being
yeah,
able to get clean eyes on these very specific things, it might even be the place where you try to do the reduction further, where you Strunk and White it and you
yeah,
say
yeah,
reduce any unnecessary words. I find,
yeah,
and this, maybe gets into a kind of bigger conversation, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and I think it kind of ties in with this, and I saw some comments people made about your tweets and about your post about how many kind of very human concepts we're applying. Like, hey, the idea of
yeah. I
a
saw that.
diary is a very human idea, right? But I
Yeah,
think what we're learning is that the very most effective technique for agents is to kind of treat them like people
right.
and to think
Yeah,
about them as people and to think like, oh, I should give them very human instructions and I should give them very human words. And that's going to help with the context. And, again, I keep going back to the
yeah,
front end design skill, which Anthropic had a great post about. And it's just so tight when you read it. It's 600 words, 700 words. Like this
yeah,
is this is good writing where you've taken a really big idea and you've sort of shrunk it down into this tiny little context. I kind of do feel like there's a whole new frontier that we're coming back around on here where it's going to really matter your ability to write and think clearly and articulate clearly and reduce the natural slop that surely comes out as part of these diary entries. And just kind of
yeah.
thinking about those pieces, which are also just good for humans. Like I think that what's the convergence that I think is really interesting right now is this. It feels like what's good for agents by and large is also good for human developers.
Yeah. Well, okay, that's an interesting point right there because one of the points that Boris, Cloud Code kind of creator, and Kat Wu, Cloud Code PM, mentioned in one of their pods is indeed that all the tools used by Cloud Code are dual use. They're just tools that we use, Bash tool, grep, and so forth. So that kind of dual use concept is like kind of idea one, indicating that like, listen, we're just giving Cloud Code the same tools that you or I would use. So the dual use tools is already kind of a principle that's used with Cloud Code. And then indeed, like instructing it in the way you instruct a human. Like actually one of the really good pieces of prompting advice that I originally someone from Anthropic shared was treat an agent like a new coworker and explain tasks to an agent just like you would explain a new coworker. It's like really like new coworker onboarding. And so I think that is pretty reasonable. On some of the approaches here, I think these are some of the decisions I walk through. I actually happen to typically I run the diary command within a session that is like interesting. I like, okay, I want to save this because I don't want to save every session. Subtle point, but like, so right now I don't have a hook or anything for diary creation unless I do have a pre-compact hook. So if I do compaction, I create a diary entry just as a proxy. Longer sessions are likely more valuable. So I always will create a diary entry if I compact. Otherwise it's manual. So I just will manually run diary whenever like I have an interesting session. And I will just mention briefly some of the places I found this to be really useful. Like basically, Here's a really good one is PR feedback. So for example, like if you run PR comments command in Claude, it'll pull in all the comments from your remote branch. If you're doing PR review, really helpful. You get kind of feedback. Okay, I need to change this style points or kind of style recommendations and so forth. Great things to capture in memory, right? So that's a really good one. Git workflow stuff, how I like to do things. Great stuff. Just throw into CLAUDE.md. Testing practices, code quality considerations, agent design principles. And those are all things I've found that the system can really naturally pick up really well. And it's actually the final one, self-correction, is a very important point because I know sometimes CLAUDE.md rules need enforcement. I'll give a funny example of that. I don't know if you've noticed it, but natively, when you ask Claude Code to, like, for example, create like a commit, it'll add Claude Code attribution to your commit. You notice that?
Yep.
It'll be like, this is authored by Claude Code. And so in your repo, it'll show like you and Claude Code authored this stuff. And sometimes I want that. I don't care, but sometimes you don't. You don't necessarily want that attribution to be tagged for any number of reasons. And so that was something that actually was hard to instruct out. I found Claude would like ignore those instructions quite a bit. So I had to basically, the system caught that and added more reinforcement to my CLAUDE.md to tell it, don't add Claude attribution to commit messages. Small thing, but actually quite important. So I found it to be very effective at catching these cases of rule violation.
Yeah, I think on the last episode we talked about it, and honestly, I'm still, this is my biggest frustration with all of Claude Code and skills is just its sort of general inability to consistently discover them. Even as you rewrite the descriptions, I think last time we talked about, I built this whole crazy pre-message hook that
I remember that.
Cerebrus to search over and pass things in. I'm still using that. It's still fairly effective, but I'm very interested in some of these learning techniques. One of the big ones that I find myself doing, and I don't have a command for it, though I probably should, is, one of the biggest kind of, I like this context evolution thing is just within skills, especially as you're developing them, you try them out and then you see what works and what doesn't. And you really want the system to pick up what worked and what didn't, and then kind of update the skill appropriately, right? I feel like, again, in this context, in this idea that a lot of what I find in agents is that I'm sort of using skills to test out new techniques before I write code. Some of them may always stay as skills, but some of them actually are better off being scripts, right? There are fully deterministic things. So I have been working on a project where I'm running like 5 work trees at a time with different feature development. Each of those work trees needed its own database. So I'm basically splitting off the main database all the time when I split off a work tree. And so I started as a skill where I'm just like feeling out exactly what do I want this work tree to work like how do I want my work tree? It needs to, I wanted to pick up its own localhost port so that I could just I wanted to run all 5 of these work trees at the exact same time and then just be able to merge them all back up to main whenever they were ready, and everything would be generally cool. And, in that way, it was awesome to start as a skill because you don't need to write any code. You're just like, hey, here's the kind of rough steps that I think I want you to do. And then after like a week of using it, then it was so dialed in that I flipped it over to a script. And, and again, it's sort of like, this is why I like this like primitive idea. You could think of it as that's just, reducing down the context, right? Like that doesn't need to be a skill. It's a fully deterministic process. It's much better off as a 10-line bash script or whatever it is, right? Like it's nothing particularly complicated. It's actually much more complicated to write it than it is to write the code. I think the opportunity here with all this context stuff is to bring, I think what you're really playing with that I like so much is just that these are the primitives of agents, and we just are finding new ways to stack stuff, right? And so, we've got the reduce primitive, and we've got the write primitive, and we read and we take those for granted, and they're tools, but they're not just tools, right? There's a couple of them that are the kind of core primitives, and then we just start finding new ways to recombine them. But there might only be 5 or 6 of these real primitives in here.
No, a few points on that. I think we're kind of observing that there's a small number of core primitives needed for agents in the sense that if you look at Manus, if you look at Claude Code, they're only using a small number of tools. There's like a small number of atomic tools that they're using. One, for example, with Claude Code, one is the task tool. That's for context isolation. That spins up a subagent. And then they have like various file manipulation tools. That's for offloading. I will mention the point you made about skill. We talked about this a lot previously about skill finding. Is a very general problem. There's also a problem with tools, by the way. It's funny, I just pulled this post up, but so Anthropic now has a tool search tool. And it's exactly what you had built with skills. It's the same problem. It's just in the tool space. It's like I've N and MCP servers bound now. How do I figure out which one? Anyway, you can read the post, but like it's a whole thing that they built out to help with this exact problem. And like it'll selectively search across your MCPs based on the task. And I don't know the details of the implementation. I don't think it's I'm sure it's it's behind it's done on server side on their side. It's the same problem. So like there's a broader discipline here of like how do you design your action space, which is to say what tools do I bind to the model, how are those tools found, and then what do I offload to the file system as skills and how are they found. And like the simplest example is I have a small number of atomic tools like Claude Code, it's like 12 tools, and then I push everything else to the file system. That's fine. But like they're talking about here, well, okay, problem one, what if I have a lot of skills like you have? How do you search for them? Whole problem. Or what if I have like 2 or 3 MCP servers in my tool space that have lots of in my function calling space that have lots of different functions in them. I need to search for those. Problem 2. So I think there's a whole discipline here of like how do you design your action space, which is non-trivial. And hit to the point you made that like it's tricky to search through large numbers of candidate actions to determine which one to use, whether it's in skill space like on the file system or whether it's as a bunch of functions. Hard problem.
Yeah, and I think we're just going to keep looping it, right?
Yeah.
Like eventually your Claude.md is going to get too many diary entries and you're going to need a diarization for the Claude.md, right? Like this is just, I think this is probably the pattern.
That's true.
And I come back a lot. We talked about it a couple episodes ago, but I think that Karpathy had an interesting note he made. I think it was on the Dwarkesh podcast where he said he's kind of waiting for these models that are super, super small and kind of know how to do things, but don't know things. And I kind of feel like that's a lot of also what we're trying to get at is we're kind of trying to reduce the context down as much as possible to just what's absolutely necessary with the hope that we can make them as controllable as possible, right? That's the idea of the tool search is like, okay, well, I could have lots of tools, but then, my hit rate on getting the right tool is lower. If I limit the tools and I figure out a way to make it very controllable so it always uses the tool search, then I should have because I'm offloading. And again, I feel like it's the exact same thing as my work tree thing, which is, the beauty of this is we're also engineers, right? And so at the end of the day, we can use these non-deterministic methods as we're in this experimental space. But when we start to figure out the pattern that we want to solidify, it often makes sense to go back to code and, sort of bitter lesson be damned. Like over time, we can rip the code back out once the models are smart enough. But, until that point, I think we've talked about this a bunch, like, until that point, the best technique is the best technique, whatever the best technique is. And as long as you're committed to continually reevaluating it, then who cares, right? Like just do the thing to make it work today, as long as you don't cut off your opportunities for tomorrow.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that whatever search algorithm they're using here, you're using something. For example, for my memories, you're right. Like basically, as you scale a system like what I saw with Claude Diary, you have many, many different kind of memories that you want to save to this Claude.md. The Claude.md then starts to bloat, and you're back to the classic problem of a kind of search and retrieval. I wonder if under the hood, they're doing some kind of semantic search here across tool descriptions, which is a technique that we saw very much earlier in the arc of this kind of AI wave. RAG was a very, very big thing, kind of 2023. Obviously, still is very, very widely used. It's a very important use case. But I wonder if just kind of classic search and retrieval techniques do have an opportunity to inject themselves in, for example, things like tool search, skill search, memory accumulation. Like, for example, I'm nearly sure that like with ChatGPT memory, their memory feature, I'm sure my guess is there's indexing memories, and then they're like using semantic search to fetch them on demand and load them to the context. So my guess is they're using RAG for that, because like there's many discrete memories that you'd want to just search over. I'm sure they're not loading those all into context. So, basically RAG could become relevant across a number of these techniques as like the scale grows.
Using the full tool chest available to you is the only rational approach, unless you're a purist and you're, getting your ML PhD and all you care about is the definition of intelligence. Like, if you're trying to solve problems, I think you should use the full set of techniques. And again, sometimes like some deterministic code is the very easiest way to do it. And sometimes it's these other things. And, but I do think, I think the kind of general pattern that we're seeing overall is just we're all wrapping our arms around what it means to build with agents. And, what we're doing is we're essentially kind of figuring out the techniques that work, and then we're figuring out ways to standardize them. And some of that standardization is naturally going to end up being like, oh, well, the best way to reduce context is to add semantic search over the top of it, whatever it is, that makes sense. And one day, like maybe 2 million token context windows will really work, and we'll have to rip all our semantic search out. But, for now, we're good.
Yeah. And also I will mention briefly, I thought that Claude Code was smart in terms of introducing the hooks primitive, because it does allow you to introduce kind of deterministic code at any given step in that agent loop. And so, for example, before every tool call or after every tool call, you can do a thing, or, after the model call, you can do a thing. So that is kind of a clever way to inject determinism in this like kind of inherently non-deterministic agent loop. Yeah, I thought that was a smart primitive, obviously, for this reason. At least I use the pre-compact hook. So I kick off a diary entry. Anytime we have compaction, I kick off a diary entry. So I do automate it in that sense.
Speaking of really good primitives, did you see the news that ChatGPT, somebody discovered skills in there? They got it to spit out a zip full of skills.
That is funny. I saw that, right? That like ChatGPT has kind of, they're like also using this notion of skills. Funny. I mean,
makes sense, right?
It makes
fundamentally,
sense.
We're just talking about progressive disclosure, right? Like, skills are just a name for progressive disclosure. And then, the other funny thing that I think, and it kind of goes back to the conversation we were having earlier, is because it seems like the technique that makes the most sense is to give your agents context in a very similar way that you give it humans. It kind of makes more sense to give it the brand that already exists, like skills, rather than try to brand it yourself. Part of that is also just a developer thing, right? Like, you've got a bunch of developers you're trying to get to adopt something. And obviously, that's something you think a lot about. But I wonder if part of the other side of it is just knowing that Codex or ChatGPT is going to go look at the web and there's all this talk about skills, that you want to name things the same thing so that the AI can more easily go find that.
Yeah, I saw that briefly, but didn't look into it. Like, so what skills are available to ChatGPT, for example? Is it like it's in some hosted?
Yeah, it's in some hosted directory. It's got the basic, Word docs and PDFs.
Okay,
and stuff like that so far.
Okay,
not totally clear how it's sort of all going to fit together, but I assume we'll find out soon.
Yeah, it's funny. I did notice that though.
My other quick hit is just, I know everybody's played with it at this point, but I am very interested in some of the things that Nano Banana opens up. I don't know how much you've gotten into it, but like...
No. I've heard some cool stuff on slide generation, though.
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's the first image model where I start to think, oh, there's kind of a whole new set. So one really fun and interesting kind of workflow that I did that kind of turned me on to thinking about this totally new way is I was working through, I'm trying to build a kind of workbench down in my basement, and I wanted to mount some pegboards to the back of it. And Gemini was essentially able to work with me and then give me a schematic. And obviously it's not a perfect schematic, but it's a pretty damn good schematic of how to kind of mount this pegboard and where to mount it onto the, and, then I was playing a little bit with generating OG Open Graph images for content pages. And Nano Banana feels like one of those spaces, kind of like using Claude Code for the first time, where it's like when you play a video game and a new area of your map gets lit up. Right. I'm like, oh, I think there's like some new stuff that is going to get discovered here that if I spend some more time with it, there's some fun.
Well, walk me through that. So how is it like materially different or better than, for example, image gen in ChatGPT?
One, it's just its ability to place actual text on images is incredible.
Okay, got it.
It's able to like actually place proper text, which
good for diagrams.
Diagrams. And so, again, I'm doing this schematic of a workbench, and it's very interesting to be able to get it to sort of really do. And then, this is like what has been happening across all these models for the last few years. I just haven't seen this big of a step. It's just instruction following is the second one. It's just, I was working with a friend on something over the weekend. It was just like doing some renovation stuff. And I was showing him some of what you could do with visualizing renovations for his bathroom. It's pretty incredible. I mean, it's like, and again, what's interesting to me here is just that, like, it's that idea of like lighting up a new space. Like, it was possible before with enough work to get it to kind of faithfully reproduce an image and then layer things on top of it. But it took a lot of work, and the failure rate
took a lot of work.
Pretty high. What starts to happen when you kind of have this stuff on demand is very interesting to me. Even in agents, like what starts to happen if you could generate images that are example images that you're then going to kind of play back to the agent to help, it can read it visually. And I don't know what it is. It just feels like a thing I want to spend more time with.
Well, I will say, it's funny, right? Like Claude 3.5, when that dropped, the tool calling suddenly was like, it was like a step above the prior, and then it really opened up the coding space, and Cursor blew up, and the rest is history. Claude Code came later. So it is true that these kind of like qualitative jumps in capacity do open up new frontiers. And like, you're right, like image gen ChatGPT is like good. But if I wanted something detailed, like fine refinements, like I wouldn't do like diagrams or a slide in there. Too hard to get it right. Like good for cartoon images, right?
Yeah.
But if I could really get like high quality diagrams that I could like edit easily, like, oh no, change this here, and it would like just work. That opens up a lot of new stuff I would do. Right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Now it's like I do cartoons. I do image gen for cartoon images and memes. But if it could actually work like at a very high level of detail, then like I'm doing a lot of work on the house, design renderings, like schematics, slide graphics.
Well, I was as we were playing over the weekend with the bathroom. It's like, hey, show me some different wallpaper designs, and it's like, obviously they're not real. You can't go buy them. But like if you're early in a process and you're trying to just sort of imagine things. So, I don't know exactly what that looks like, but I think there's something really fundamentally interesting.
Well, I mean, I know don't spend too much time on this, but I spent a lot of time recently, like we redid a whole bunch of the house, and I would love to have been able to take a picture of the current state of like the bathroom and then just like overlay different like tile designs. And
so
it can do that well. It can do that
almost perfectly.
Okay. Yeah. Like that was the thing I kind of tried with ChatGPT. I was like, kind of wasn't there. I didn't even bother wasting my time. It just works. Like you can send it a picture of your bathroom, and a picture of like a tile from a website, and it would just like overlay it.
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
It's very cool. And again, I think there's pretty cool specific use case, but I think what's kind of more interesting here is just as we're in the business of like figuring out ways to utilize these tools in new kinds of ways. I just think there's a lot of really creative things you can start to do when you have that capability available to you in your toolbox. It's kind of like, we talked last time about having Cerebrus and having super 3,000 token, 2,000 token a second models. Like that's a tool you have that you can now do new kinds of things with. And I think, ultimately all of these things are going to come back together to be the full tool chest for doing agentic development, and how you recombine them and in what creative ways you do it. I think I think that's probably a good place to wrap up.
Always fun.
Happy holidays. Always a pleasure talking to you. And we'll be back soon. We have a list of like 15 more topics to talk about.
There you go.